So I've been asked once again to deliver a hortatory address to you students, affectionately called by some the Fathead Talk. Now, because I gave an address of this very same title just last year, I'm taking care not to repeat myself too much. However, here at the front end, I do want to remind you of my main points from last year. I just want to touch on them. That way you'll have a good foundation to build on as I move into some new territory in the latter part of this talk. So here's the quick review. Titus 2:11-14 tells us that we should live soberly, righteously, and godly. And the trustees, administration, and faculty of NSA have reached the settled conclusion that this includes you guys. So, first, when it comes to your interactions with U of I and WSU students, comport yourself with true humility. Proverbs 27:2, Romans 12:3. People who receive a first-rate education and who then put on airs are only establishing that they did not really understand their education. They didn't get it. Second, do not give Christian liberty a bad name. Romans 14:6, Proverbs 12:15. Beer, 18-year-olds, loud music, and 1 a.m. should not be friends or even acquaintances. Over here too. Third, a biblical worldview is not the same thing as being artsy-fartsy for Jesus. Literary structures are not an all-purpose disinfectant. If your head knowledge is not resulting in practical holiness, then off to hell with it. Fourth, don't believe lies on the internet about a community that you should actually know better than the liars do. It is not just a sin to tell lies. It is also a sin to believe them. Fifth, don't cluster together with other people on the basis of a deep communion in your respective complaining spirits. Have nothing to do with any kind of fellowship of the grievance, AKA fog, fellowship of the grievance. It's amazing how people who have a grievance about anything can find each other. And last, your church is supplying you with spiritual meals. Regardless of where you attend here in Moscow, your church is supplying you with spiritual meals. Eat your peas and don't play around with them. Worship God honestly, fully, and weekly from the heart. That's a reminder of what I touched on last year. And now into some new territory. I want to talk about girls and guys. Your very favorite subject. Don't lie to me. So, Romans 12:3 says this, "For I say, through the grace given unto me, to every man that is among you, not to think of himself more highly than he ought to think, but to think soberly, according as God has dealt to every man the measure of faith." Now, we rarely use these words anymore because of the effectiveness and reach of the enemy's propaganda. But one of the goals of NSA is to graduate manly men and to graduate womanly women. Now, if my use of the adjectives manly and womanly made you flinch or cringe, or if a little part of you died inside, then this exhortation is for you. And if you thought, oh boy, lay it on, then I'm happy to oblige there as well. Ladies, you have come of age in an era that has been flattering you shamelessly for as long as you've been alive. And the flattery is unceasing. The conservative church in America has been complicit in this as well, with the result that many of you believe in your bones that there's no such thing as a distinctively feminine sin. Everybody believes that there are distinctively masculine sins, but nobody believes that there are distinctively feminine sins. Theologians will say, sure, women sin, but those are generic people sins. But men sin as men, and they sin as men all the way down. And this, what's riding in the background here is the idea of toxic masculinity. In many big box evangelical churches, if you go to church on Father's Day, what's going to happen is you're going to see men kicked around the sanctuary for 45 minutes. Men step up. Men, you're a mess. Men, you're just going to see men kicked around. Can you imagine going to a church on Mother's Day and seeing anything comparable happen? No. That's because you women, we believe in you. You're really something. Now, many of you may be really something, but that phrase admits of different meanings. So, what I'm getting at is that many of you are far more feminist than you think you are. You are far more feminist than you think you are. You might reply in self-defense that you grew up in a complementarian church, which is part of my point, actually. Much of the complementarianism world is simply right-wing egalitarianism. Right? It is just simply egalitarianism that has a few reservations still. Say that you overhear a male student in the Commons who says offhand that he hopes his future wife will be able to make biscuits the way his mom does, and all of your defensive hackles go up. You find yourself seething over the fact that he will never receive a biscuit from your hands, however good the biscuit might be, and they're pretty good, and this means that you might be the problem. In fact, you might be the problem even if he was kind of dweeby in the way that he said it. And if you go to one of our many weddings and you trip over the fact that one of our pastors has the bride promise to quote unquote obey her husband, then this is what I'm talking about. If you find yourself mentally substituting phrases like mutual companionship or shared decision making, then just assume that the woke virus has taken up residence in you. That is possible. It happens all over the conservative world. The outside world has lost its mind, but that does not mean that little fragments of that mental instability have not made their way into our world. This would be the case even if you were only worried that keeping such phrases like obey in the wedding ceremony could be a stumbling block for the dweebs. They might take far too much encouragement from it and start looking around for their biscuits. But take it from a pastor, the dweebs need far more encouragement than the feminist girl bosses do, especially girl bosses who do not understand how they have been shaped. All right? It is astounding to me how much error has seeped into the church under the guise of just being winsome or accommodating or whatever. So, ladies, just assume that you're far more feminist than you think you are. But since I brought up dweebs, gents, you are called by God to be tough, intellectually, spiritually, emotionally, and physically tough. You want stereotypes? I'm going to give you some stereotypes. Paul wants you to quit you like men, 1 Corinthians 16:13. You are supposed to be tough already, and we want you to grow a lot tougher. The challenge here is that many of you are not nearly as tough as you think you are. That's the challenge. You're not nearly as tough as you think you are. And if that assertion were true, as I believe it is, who do you have in your life who would be willing to tell you about it? If you're not nearly as tough as you think you are, who's going to tell you that? A good way to evaluate yourself is simply to ask how many excuses you've made over the last week or two. And if you respond by saying that they were not technically excuses, but rather explanations, then consider your case a serious one. You need true friends among your classmates and true mentors in the faculty and true friends who will speak the truth to you. Proverbs 27:6. But this most certainly does not include your circle of companions who have the same problem that you do, but who are willing to flatter you in order to get some flattery in return. That kind of thing is just bro flirting. You find yourself in any kind of bro flirting, stop it. It's just, I might run across it on the internet, and then the yelling you hear in the next sermon would, anyway. The softness that you are currently tolerating, the softness that you are currently tolerating, is not something that glorifies God in any way. The excuses you assemble might be good enough for that girl you're interested in, because in the glow of youth and chick flick assumptions, she is willing to overlook stuff. But I can assure you that when you've been married to her for 10 years, such excuses will no longer be nearly as compelling. They won't work the same way. Right? It gets tedious, it gets old really quickly. I'm part of as a pastor, I'm part of the ambulance crew. I'm one of the spatula crew. We go out to car wrecks and scrape people off the highway, and we go in and we tell them, you should have listened to that Fathead talk back at NSA 10 years ago. There are things that you can accommodate, you can carry for the time being because you're young and you don't have as many responsibilities as you're going to have in 10 years. But it's still a devastating error. And if you take it in, if you allow it to become part of your settled character, you're just asking for trouble. So all of this guys and girls part of the talk is not about courting. It's not about courtship. It's about the kind of person you are. And as I never get tired of saying, you need to become the kind of person that the kind of person you would like to marry would like to marry. What are you doing? Are you looking for a particular kind of person, or are you trying to become a particular kind of person? I remember many years ago, a young man, it was the springtime, NSA, young man came into my office and wanted to talk to me about the possibility of calling a certain young lady's father. And as it happened, the young lady in question was boarding with us, and we knew her quite well. And I have to tell you that this young man had excellent taste. She was a fine young woman. And he laid out his case. He said he told me all the reasons why he thought she would be wonderful for him, all the ways she would bless him and help him out and be all her gifts that would help him. And I listened to him, and then I said, so great, in what ways would you be good for her? And it was like someone hit him in the forehead with a baseball bat. That thought had never entered his head. Oh, it's not just whether she'd be good for me. Am I going to be good for anything? Am I going to be good for anybody? So the thing you want to do, especially you freshmen, when you arrive here and you've got this seething cauldron of freshmen, many of whom are cute. And you say, oh, this is a new world. Well, what? My high school, my homeschool high school, had a lot smaller population. And all the girls were my sisters. So, all of a sudden you're interested in that moment, you're still in that moment right now. You're still in that time period right now. And what it boils down to is you're going to be attracted in this moment on the basis of personality. And what you want to be attracted to is character. The issue is character. Now, it's not that we're not Manichaean, we're not dualists. We believe that looks and personality and all of that's part of the package. But a woman who fears the Lord is to be praised, as it says in Proverbs. You want to become the kind of man that the kind of woman you would want to marry, and you want to become the kind of woman that the kind of man you would want to have anything to do with. And so that's the first thing. Men, you want to be tougher than you are, tougher than you think you are. Women, you ought to be looking for and ditching every vestige of feminism that you can find. Now, some of you are wondering, is he going to qualify any of this? There's a toughness that's not good. There's a toughness that's abrasive. There's a toughness that does not please God. Yes, there is such a thing, and I'm not going to qualify anything. So, next thing, lust for respectability. Lust for respectability. God has blessed us greatly here in Moscow. I can't begin to tell you all the things that have happened and have been given to us from the hand of the Lord, and we don't deserve a bit of it, and we're very grateful. As he has blessed us, our community has grown, and it has grown enormously. New St. Andrews College is right smack in the middle of all of this. New St. Andrews is a major player when it comes to this blessing and growth. Now, granted, there are many aspects of this growth that are enjoyable to pretty much all Christians and to a lot of non-Christians. But enough about the tri-tip at the block party. Everybody likes the tri-tip at the block party. There are certain manifestations of what's going on that are the fruit out at the end of the branches is delicious to everyone, attractive to everyone. But when you start examining what are the roots, where does this come from? How did this get here? That's where people start to divide. We have grown to the point where we are starting to teeter on the threshold of true respectability. That should wake you up with the flop sweats at night. True respectability. We know this because some among us are starting to care a great deal about such respectability, and there are others who are trying to bestow such respectability upon us. And there is a certain kind of bestowal of respectability which ought to be viewed by people trying to get the bit and bridle on. They're trying to get something on you that will enable them to steer more effectively. But the way that we got to this point was by not caring at all about respectability. Now, we care about, we want to be accountable to God. We want to be upright in the eyes of God, but there's a worldly respectability that the Bible tells us that we are supposed to have contempt for. Jesus says in the Gospel of John, how can you believe when you receive honor from one another? Think about that. Jesus says, how can you believe if you're hungry for the award? How can you believe if you receive awards from one another? How can you believe if you receive honor from one another? The way we got to the point where we are is by not caring at all about respectability. And now this has been a deliberate policy. This is a biblical conviction, it's a worldview conviction, and a consequent policy, and it's not the result of certain character deficiencies that you might assume are the only possible explanation for some of our marketing ads. Those are not flukes, right? Those are not flukes. Respectable ads would win the approval of library ladies everywhere who could find nothing in them to shush. They would be solemn and studious and quiet and slick and effeminate and glossy and risk-averse and cowardly and tedious enough to make anyone's back teeth ache. There's a way of doing this that the world applauds, and it's as hollow as a jug. I remember many years ago, and this was part of the inception of New St. Andrews, I've been involved in planting and building and nurturing Logos School, and my daughter, Mrs. Merkel, was in the kindergarten class when we opened Logos School, and so she was consequently in the first graduating class, the first full graduating class that had gone all the way through. And when she was a junior or senior, whenever that was, whenever you take your tests, I don't know, there's some conniver somewhere that puts your name on lists. And she did very well on her standardized tests. And so we started to get mailings from all over the country, glossy mailings from Christian colleges. They saw her scores and they wanted her to come. And looking at these brochures, a number of them came in, I concluded that the purpose of Christian higher education in North America was to make lifelong friends, ride horses, and eat pizza. And all of them had pictures of students and cute girls and everything. And nobody talked about education. Nobody talked about what it was for. But you could compose a campaign that would not draw any ire from the library ladies of both sexes. So you could put together this marketing campaign, and that marketing campaign, this respectable marketing campaign, would walk down the halls of any responsible media campaign with a little twinkle in its step. So I would refer you to Robert Conquest's third law. Also refer you to the first two laws, but the third law is, I think, brilliant. Robert Conquest's third law of politics. Quote, "The simplest way to explain the behavior of any bureaucratic organization is to assume that it is controlled by a cabal of its enemies." Let me give that to you again. The simplest way to explain the behavior of any bureaucratic organization is to assume that it is controlled by a cabal of its enemies. Or as P.J. Woodhouse once noted, in leading an organization, you have to recognize that a bunch of your people are up to something, and the rest of them are up to something else. This is a reality. I mean, there are hundreds of you here. This is a reality that is going to take shape at some point in any organization's growth. And it has to be acknowledged that we are nearing that inflection point now. In a college, this can creep in at any level, whether board, admin, faculty, staff, or students. In the Twitter blow-up over the Johnny Cash ad, which you may have heard about, a former teacher at Bethlehem College openly acknowledged his attempts to sabotage the direction of the college. He said, he just went on there and said, "This is what I did when I was teaching there." The fact that he got pretty thoroughly fisked and ratioed does not change my point. He just went online and bragged about how he had been treacherous. I was there and I refused to cooperate with the direction of the college. Saboteurs are not usually very reflective people. They're not aware of what they're actually doing. If you would like to dig into this phenomenon more deeply, as you most certainly should, I would commend Dr. Rigney's Emotional Sabotage book to you. Under the very best construction, putting the best construction on it, such confusion muddles up what the Fallowhides were doing inside the Shire and what Strider was doing outside the Shire for the Shire. What are the Fallowhides doing in the Shire, and what is Strider doing for the Shire? As Aragorn put it at the Council of Elrond, "Yet we would not have it otherwise. If simple folk are free from care and fear, simple they will be, and we must be secret to keep them so. But we don't want you to be the simpletons. We don't want you to be the simple ones who just assume that communities like this just happen by themselves. They don't happen by themselves. They have to be nurtured. They have to be guarded. They have to be protected. And they have to be put together with wisdom. And if God doesn't bless it, all the planning and thinking that we come up with won't be sufficient. But when God blesses, there are certain things about it that he is blessing. To putting it bluntly, we did not try to attract you here with the Moscow mood so that you would come in order to try to fix the Moscow mood. Yes, I go to NSA, but I don't agree with everything. Well, of course you don't agree with everything. Golly. In what world, inhabited by grown-ups, does anybody ever agree with everybody else? There is no such world. So why did you feel the compulsion to say that? All right? Everybody knows that there's no community of people anywhere that has universal agreement automatically. Everybody knows that. That's a commonplace. So where does that urge to say something about that come from? It arises from the fact that you are being steered. You are being steered, and people will look at you disapprovingly if you don't say that. But in what world are the residents constantly careful to put daylight between themselves and any progressive disapproval? Yes, I live in Moscow, but I don't. But we want Kirkers, not shirkers. And someone's going to say, well, when you say you don't want us to be a shirker, what you're saying is that you want us to agree with everything. No, I'm not saying that. I'm saying I don't want you to be a coward. I don't want you to be a coward. In what world are all loyalties and associations constantly hedged around with bubble wrap qualifications and enough cotton batting to create the requisite distance? Spurgeon once said that some men preach the way a donkey eats a thistle, very carefully. The text is the thistle. In what world do people always feel the need to cater to and buffer themselves against the anticipated, progressive, or respectable disapproval? That would be the world in which the inhabitants have not yet benefited from an NSA education. But this leads to another thing, just one more thing, the last thing. Someone might complain, someone might object to our ads, as I have heard done before, with the complaint that they are inaccurate. They are inaccurate. They say something like, this portrayal does not match what is actually being done here. Yes, there's an element of truth in that, but we are working on you. Are there any questions? Yes?
How do you kill the lust for respectability in your own heart?
Okay, the first thing, I'll repeat it, the question. How do you kill the lust for respectability in your own heart? The first step that you have to take in mortifying any sin, not just this one, but to mortify any sin, is to name it correctly, name it accurately, to see it and identify it for what it is when it's going on, right? So when you feel that impulse, and before you speak, before you say anything, before you sign up, before you answer the phone, before you do anything, you look at the reaction you're having and call it something. What is this? Why do I feel this way? And then name it accurately. When you name it accurately, and it's very simple, it's very straightforward from that point. How do you kill the lust? How do you kill a covetousness? How do you kill lust? How do you kill anger? How do you mortify these things? Well, you name it. In 1 John 1:9, it says, if we confess our sins, he is faithful and just to forgive us our sins and cleanse us from all unrighteousness. The word confess there is homologeo, which literally means to speak the same thing. So logeo is to speak, homa is the same. So when God calls it a lust for respectability, or in John where Jesus says you're seeking honor from one another, what you do is you look at it and say, God, I am seeking the praise of men and not approval from you. Now, when you name it, you confess it, naming it the same thing the Bible names it. Then you ask God to apply the blood of Christ to it, which he does. He cleanses you from all unrighteousness. Now, I'll guarantee you, if you start doing that, about the third time, you're going to have a lot more awareness of what's going on in your heart. A lot of times we don't know how to get out. We don't know how to mortify it because we want to live pleasantly in the fog. But as soon as you start doing the bracing thing of naming things accurately, you're 2/3 of the way there. Yes?
How does NSA view other Christians, or I should say churches, who desire to live in the same manner, seeking after Christ in all of life, yet at the same time do not seek to do it in the same exact way?
Okay, to repeat the question, how does NSA think of churches, evangelical Reformed churches, who are on the same page with us in many of our goals, but who would not adopt all of our tactics or would not do it the same way? Is that fair? We would extend to them the right hand of fellowship, and we are delighted and happy for Christians who do things differently than we do. Right? So we would say, God bless you. We want to encourage you. We want to pray for you. And that's something the CREC churches here in Moscow do. We cultivate good relations with other evangelical churches. We pursue that. We want to have that. Now, this might take a moment of explanation, but the Christian world is a pretty big place. And there are a lot of people who do a lot of different things differently, right? Now, going back to the sabotage that I was talking about earlier, I'm pretty small c Catholic when it comes to Christians doing things differently. I can be friends with dispensationalists and charismatics and Baptists, and I'm pretty Catholic in who I could sit down with and fellowship with and work together in certain projects with. So I don't feel any obligation for them to do things that I wouldn't do. All right, I don't feel any obligation when the fact that they're doing things that I wouldn't do, that doesn't chafe me at all. What sabotage does is involves me doing things that I wouldn't do. Do you see the difference? If there's a guy in a church across town, he's preaching the cross, he's preaching the gospel, and he just doesn't have the interest or the gifts, or he disagrees with what I call the satiric bite. Let's say he just doesn't, that's not his cup of tea. I just want to bless him and pray for him and hold him up as a brother in Christ. And I would like him to do the same for us. Yes?
Along those lines, what's your best piece of advice for dealing with interdenominational differences amongst the student body itself?
Okay, what's my best advice for dealing with interdenominational differences within the student body? Okay, so let me start with a very practical one, all right? It matters who's courting whom. Okay, the first thing to do is before you have to deal with how do we get along at lunch without fighting, is we have this, let's say a Baptist guy is interested in a Paedo-Baptist girl, interdenominational difference. Well, you're going to have to, if this goes anywhere, you're going to have babies that you're going to have to decide to do something with or not, right? You should anticipate that sort of thing. Right. So I would, but if both parties have a firm commitment to male headship and leadership, and the woman is a sweetheart and she's willing to follow his spiritual lead, there's no problem. But if the woman is decided in her convictions, she can't be having exceptions or things that I won't submit on beforehand. That's just a bad idea. So that's the first thing. That's the big deal. The next thing in interdenominational differences is that I would encourage you all to give it time to settle in your minds. The chances are pretty good that when you've come here, you're encountering perspectives from people who love the Lord that you've not encountered before. And it would be easy to lurch, and I would encourage none of you to lurch. No doctrinal lurching. Grow, study, give it a year, read the books, do the reading. Don't grab onto something just because it's new and exciting and different. Then the next thing is, the third thing I would say, is there's a difference between being able to fellowship with a group of friends with a bunch of doctrinal differences at a study group over pizza, okay? You might, if you're quarrelsome or if you're unwise, you could find yourself in a big tussle, but it's not a necessary tussle. If I can get together with a charismatic brother for lunch, I could get together with a dispensational brother for lunch, and we could just fellowship in the Lord. But if we tried to organize a joint worship service, we would have to decide what to do. We'd have to decide what songs to sing. We'd have to decide, and so consequently, I would encourage you as students to stay out of organized activities where you have to decide what to do, because that's just going to introduce conflict before it's even necessary. So I would just enjoy the fellowship and enjoy the experience of getting to know what it's like to think weird thoughts the way he does or the way she does. Enjoy it, in other words. Yes?
Do you have any literary examples of men or of boys who become the kind of character who, the kind of person they would want to marry?
Okay, so the question is, do I have any literary examples from literature of men becoming the kind of boys becoming the kind of men, or men becoming the kind of men that are worth paying attention to? Is that the question? This is odd, because I would say virtually any coming of age story that's consistent with the biblical worldview. So Sam Gamgee comes back a very different person than he would have been had he never left. Right? That would be a good example. He comes back at the end of the Lord of the Rings and he marries. So his is the comedic element. Frodo and Bilbo and Gandalf, they all go off into the West. Tolkien was a Catholic guy and a melancholic, and only he, in all his brilliance, could make going to heaven so sad. You go down to the gray harbors in the twilight, and there are leaves skittering across the water, and there's Celtic music in the background, and anyway, all right, excuse me. I got distracted. So that would be one example. Another example would be Prince Caspian. Another, where you have this maturation over time. There are some historic characters where that doesn't appear to enter into it at all, like Beowulf. There's no character development or growth that way. But that's the kind of thing I'm thinking of. Can you handle things at the end of the road that you wouldn't have been able to handle at the beginning?
Can we carry swords on campus?
Swords? You may carry shovels. Any more questions? Yes.
You didn't share to qualify the idea of being tough during your talk. In other words, Q&A, you have any qualified thoughts?
Yeah. So there was a book of this title back in the 70s, I think, that I love the illustration and never read the book. But I think that men should be a velvet-covered brick. Okay, I believe that gentleness is a Christian virtue. Tenderness is a Christian virtue. Kindness is a Christian virtue. And all of it has to be framed in the right situation. You have to read your life as a story. So a shepherd who is kind to wolves is being savage to the sheep. In order to be kind to the sheep, you must be savage with wolves. You must be a fighter. Jesus says the hireling has no fire in his gut. He's just there for the minimum wage minimum wage pay, and he runs at the sign of trouble. This is what I meant earlier about what it takes to establish a community, what it takes to establish a work, what it takes to establish a college. What frequently happens is that has to be done by men who are hard. Men have to be hard. But they should be hard for their wives, not hard on their wives. And I think that if you have velvet-covered brick, it's tough where you need to be tough, and it's tender where you need to be tender, and it's wisdom to know the difference. Another example, another illustration I would use for this would be truth. Toughness, hardness, the rigidity of orthodoxy is like bones. Okay, so there's that skeleton hanging in Linnaeus, right? That's the Westminster Confession of Faith. Every bone is right in its proper place. It's anatomically correct. That's a human skeleton. The problem is that it's dead. There's not a human being. So that's truth without flesh. That's bones without flesh, truth without love. But what happens if you go the broad evangelical route where you have love without truth? Well, now, just imagine a person with all the bones out. You've got a beanbag chair, an amorphous glob. You visit their church and they undulate slowly toward you. welcome. And then you wake up panting. So that's love without truth. It's just a goopy mess. Love without truth is a goopy mess. Truth without love is just orthodusty. It's just... And what we want is the two together. We want the two together. But in our age, our sentimental age is the goopy age. So the thing that must be emphasized, and the reason I didn't qualify in the talk, is we need to be told, men, you need to be tough. Suck it up.
Would you say to a young guy that knows he needs to be hard, he wants to try to be hard, but he's worried that he's going to miss, if he takes a shot, he's worried he's going to knock something over?
Yeah. We budget for that. Right. So basically, you can't encourage young men to make their own glory without that happening, right? If we say, at some point, you have to give your teenage son the car keys and say, go. At some point, you have to let him use the chainsaw. At some point, you have to say, well, life is risky, here we go. And if you shrink back from that, not only if there's the timid servant, that there's the 10 talents, 5 talents, and 1 talent. There's the timid servant who just went and buried it. But we could retell the parable and say, and the master hesitated to give one servant 10 talents because that's a lot of talents. And he hesitated to give 5 talents because that's, man, we could lose everything. And then he has, basically, if parents or teachers or instructors shrink back from entrusting people who could really screw it up, then you're being as timid as the wicked and lazy servant is. Now, having said that, I would distinguish losses. All right, was this, when you entrusted someone with a responsibility, was this a good faith effort that missed? Or was it sheer stupidity from beginning to end? Right? There are people who make a big mess because they weren't reflective, they weren't seeking counsel, they didn't do what you told them to do with it. There's all kinds of problems, and that person needs to be admonished or taken aside, strengthened, taught further. But if you say, here's the ball, you've got to make a basket every time, or you've got to have a career of unbridled success, then you're asking of them, you're holding them to a standard that you yourself don't apply to yourself. Yes?
How could you disagree with St. Kirk's cowardly church?
Okay, so it's not the fact of the disagreement, it's the manner of the disagreement. Okay, so in fact, if you disagree and you refuse to disagree because you want to conform, that's just another form of shirking, right? So if someone says, hey, let's do this, and everybody's saying, yeah, and you think this is the worst idea I've ever heard, you need to speak up, and if you don't, you're a shirker. Or if someone is doing something that's righteous and faithful, and you say, I don't know, and you're doing it to protect yourself. Kierkegaard once said that many people they treat commentaries the way a little boy who's about to get a switching stuffs magazines down his trousers. They use commentaries that way to keep the word from spanking them. They want to buffer. So if someone says, let's say, let me give you an example. If let's say someone associated with the college, a student or a faculty member, did something that I saw it and I think, that's going to invite this response. That wasn't the wisest move in the world. Okay, and let's say that 5 minutes later I'm talking to my next door neighbor, who says, did you see what Stupid Head did? Now, if it was evil, what he did, you should not be there. You should have already be addressing it. But if it was just not the wisest thing in the world, what you do is you just lean in and identify with it. Yeah, I know him. He's great. And then it's the same thing with mom and dad. This is something that fathers and mothers need to learn when mom thinks that dad shouldn't have disciplined for that or in quite that way. And let's say it's not egregious, but she has a difference of opinion. She should just let it ride and then later talk to her husband in private away from the kids. Say, I need you mind if I talk to you about that episode, and talk to him. She should express her disagreement or her concern lest she be a shirker. But if she expresses it in the middle of the discipline, she's also a shirker. Does that clear it up? One more. If there is one more. Yes, where? So, yes.
What should be a young man's approach to profanity or vulgar, violent language? That was made reference to in the ad. So for a young man coming into NSA, coming into this kind of culture, he's trying to be a leader who can shape and one.
Yeah.
What should be the way he thinks about that?
Okay, so the question is, what should a young man, and I would say young lady's attitude be toward rough language, bad language, that sort of thing, given the NSA ad? So the thing that I would say is that your baseline ought to be, don't talk that way. That's the baseline. And if there is an occasion where you believe it's necessary to talk that way, and you do, it should surprise everybody you know. Really? So basically, if everybody rolls their eyes and says, that figures, because he talks that way to his mom, he talks that way all the time, that's not what we want. We want our tongues to be disciplined. They're weapons, they're tools, and we want to take down the tool that we need for the moment, in the moment, and then use it at that time. So too many students watching something like the NSA ad have an on-off switch, and the on-off switch says, that kind of language, okay, not okay. And since they alluded to it, it must be okay, and then they turn their switch on and then tape it open, right? Because the NSA ad did it. But here's something that was done in the ad. In the ad where it says, we want to attract young men who are willing to hoist the Jolly Roger. This does not mean that we want young men who are raiding towns in the Caribbean, capturing women and seizing gold and flying the Jolly Roger, actual Jolly Roger. And we wanted men who were willing to take Johnny Cash's favorite finger. And it was done there, and it was done very much on purpose, was the picture of Johnny Cash's face and the top of his finger that was there for a second, and then zoom out the whole picture for a nanosecond. And that was a video equivalent of me saying, I got cussed out on the street the other day and somebody sent me 20% of a wave. Or someone, they came up and said, F you. Or you use F and then 3 asterisks. Everybody knows what I'm obliquely referring to things that everybody knows what I'm referring to. Well, that was the video equivalent of that. That's what that was doing. It was alluding to it without doing it overtly. Now, here's the thing. The thing is, and I'll finish with this, and I just find this quite delightful, actually. Delightful. Some of the people who went sideways over the Twitter yesterday, it had 350,000 views. So it really went. A bunch of the people who are upset at this ad agree with us completely that it's appropriate to use an image like that to go after an adversary because they use that image on us. So what they did is they scrolled through the video, froze the moment when that nanosecond, froze that one moment, made it a static picture, and then circulated that online, which we would never do. And they did that because they think it's all right to use an image like that against their adversaries, which would be us. We agree with them. It's all right to use that image more wisely than they do when you're attacking the blasphemy of the Olympic opening ceremony, which is what which is what the ad did. So don't just copy the fact of they did this, I can do it however I please. What you want to do is study the context, study the background, learn what you're doing, learn the tools before you deploy them. Okay, thank you.